They called it a blue weather day, the kind of Mediterranean noon when the horizon is so clean it feels like a promise. The hospital ship rode slow in a long swell, white as a gull. Two supply vessels trailed her wake like dutiful cousins, and a pair of patrol boats kept a low, watchful distance, enough to be polite, enough to be useful if anyone growing desperate decided aid meant the same as undefended. On days like that, you could forget that the world was so hungry you had to stack hope like pallets and lash it down. I was standing on the starboard deck with a clipboard because habits are stubborn, and because a clipboard kept people from asking if I had a second to chat. My name is Aaron Rios, Logistics Officer, NATO Relief Tasking, auxiliary to the ship's commander. In every way that means everything runs on time, and nothing gets noticed. The sea smelled like clean fabric drying in sunlight. Far to port, a cormorant arrowed low and skimmed the water to look at herself in it. "Rios," came Maya's voice behind me, soft and amused. "You're counting waves again." I lifted the clipboard and marked a tally like a joke. If I don't count them, they might stop arriving. "And what would we do without our waves?" she asked. She was a doctor, young enough to still wear impatience like a jacket, old enough to be careful with it. She handed me a paper cup of coffee that wasn't coffee. Out here, everything developed aliases. Around us, our small world did what it was good at. The helideck had been a ballet 30 minutes before. Medevacs in and out with the anxiety of a parent watching a toddler on a playground swing. Forklifts moved in deliberate arcs. A petty officer shouted something about straps and then said it again. Quieter, and the work continued. If you want to understand a ship, listen to the way it scolds itself. We were humming along, and the hum had, for me, always been the most reassuring thing living things make. The first wrong note was a line on a monitor. You'd think the sea would warn you first. In stories, the water knows before we do. But the enunciator in the control room chirped a tone I'd never heard, then a tone like it again, and then a voice you only ever hear in training. "Please, stand by for dimensional hazard alert." Dimensional hazard meant nothing in any manual I'd ever read. I looked at Maya. She looked at me with her eyebrows making a tent. The ship is a stern parent. It hates to use unfamiliar words. When it does, you apologize and run. "Bridge?" I said into my shoulder mic. "What am I hearing?" The bridge returned something that wasn't an answer so much as a feeling. "All stations, brace for," and then a sound like a mountain exhaling. The horizon, which had been a promise, softened at the edges. Blue weather went milk blue and then bruise blue in a smear that accelerated across the world. The swell under us changed its mind. A forklift operator, trained to read the ocean in a moving shadow, cut his engine and set his palms flat on the wheel. The ship dropped, not down but through. If you've ever ridden an elevator that pauses and then decides what to do with you, that pause, prepare your organs for uncertainty, was like this. People grabbed whatever was nearest. I grabbed the clipboard because when you're frightened, you hold on to the thing that has held you every day before. The sky turned into a sheet of hammered metal, and the sun was a dent in it, and then it tore. We did not spin. We did not flip. We slipped. When we came out the other side, the sea had a new smell. It was the same water, salt, iodine, the memory of old storms, but there was another note threaded through it like a ribbon in a child's hair. It smelled warmed, tended, almost perfumed. The light was softer. The sun, in its afternoon, looked like a coin held in a fleshy palm. The coastline, because now there was coastline where there had been only horizon, was wrong in half a dozen ways that would have made a geographer swear in italics. Hills knelt closer to the sea. A cape that ought to point west pointed south, like someone shy changing the subject. On the nearest shore, a city stretched, white and tawny, as if poured from a jar. I didn't see it first. A deckhand did, and he swore in a language I didn't know and then translated it into one I did. Who built that? Maya stepped to the rail and shaded her eyes, uselessly. Do we have an ancient city ride-along? Did we miss a memo? No one laughed. The city was old the way granite is old. It had walls that were walls, no pretense of being for trucks or tourists. An aqueduct, like a skeletal centipede, crossed a valley to feed a bathhouse complex so large you could see vapors from the sea. A stadium oval yawned near the river mouth. There were wharves, serious ones, with ribbed cargo hulks tied to pilings like enormous calves at a row of mothers. People moved there, small and regular, the way ants move when they know no one is watching. "This is the part," I said, "where we call the bridge and ask it to tell us we're 2 degrees port of Naples." The bridge told us to come up and look. The captain didn't try to name the place. He stood with his hands behind him in a way that made you want to stand up straighter. He said, "Charts are nonsense. Stars are wrong by a hair. GPS reads home until it doesn't, and then it reads nothing at all." Maya leaned into the glass. "Smell that?" she asked. "It's not just water. Wood smoke. Something like rosemary. Something like animal fat. We're smelling 30,000 stoves. Or one big one." She squinted. "Watchtowers. Those are watchtowers." "Signals?" I asked. "Communications. No radio," the comms officer said. "Not noise, not chatter. If I didn't know better, I'd say there was no one here at all but us." "But there's a city," Maya said reasonably. The captain finally turned. He had the calm of somebody who had learned to have people mirror him. "We accept what we see. We act on what we know. We don't make the first mistake by trying to make everything feel like home." A petty officer with binoculars made a small noise like he'd seen a saint. "Standard bearers," he said. "And, Sir, elephants." "Say again," I said. "Because elephants were not on the checklist for a Mediterranean relief mission." The petty officer made a helpless gesture. The universal shrugged confession of a witness. "Gray. Massive. Tusks. Unless someone invented new boats that looked like a childhood picture of an elephant." We drifted on minimal power, while the captain became a diplomat in 10 minutes. Flags were found, the white of truce unfurled like a napkin in a good restaurant. Loudspeakers were adjusted and then switched off, because what would you say? "Hello, we fell through a tier in the afternoon and would like to borrow your phone." Our escorts circled tight and quiet. You can tell a professional by the way they relax their hands when you want them to be ready. Closer in, the city was more itself. Its walls had been repaired with care across centuries, once with beige stone, once with a pinkish brick, once with concrete poured in a hurry that now itself wore a beard of lichen. The streets made a grid and then gave up to follow older lines. Statues crowned arches where the paint had long ago given itself to the Sunday. There were faces carved into cornices, lions, bearded men, women with wheat in their hair. And there were soldiers, not costumes. People who owned their armor. The first ranks wore segmentata that caught the afternoon like fish scales. The bosses on their belts were polished. Their standards a golden eagle, a sun, a bundle of rods that made my stomach tighten, moved like arguments in a breeze. Behind them, a company of cavalry sat beasts that were neither the horses I knew, nor wholly strange, taller, barrel-chested, with an extra trace to carry a sort of harpoon. Farther back, on a broad cobbled quay that darted into the harbor like a tongue, something huge and gray shifted its weight and drew a breath. The sound was a bagpipe sigh. "They're waiting," Maya said, "and they don't look surprised." That was the first mercy. We weren't the first miracle these people had seen. We lowered a boat. We filled it with the sort of people who make ships move. An officer whose insignia meant he could say things without checking. 2 linguists with shrugging shoulders. A medic with a bag that could rebuild a toddler. And me. Maya pressed a hand to my shoulder. "Don't make promises," she said. "Bring me back stories instead." The water in the harbor had been trained. It moved around stone like a dog around a chair, reluctant to make trouble. As we slid in, you could see the ribbing of old submerged timbers, the shadows of nets, a discarded amphora with a weed growing from its mouth like a tongue. The soldiers waited. They were beautiful in the way that pragmatism is often beautiful. Everything on them had a reason to be where it was. A man in a cloak, the color of storm glass, stepped forward. His helmet had a crest shaped like a ship's wake. He looked right. Not at our guns, not at the boat. He looked at our faces. When he spoke, it was Latin. Not the school Latin of lawyers and mottos, but a warm, crowded thing full of vowels that know the tongue belongs behind the teeth. Our linguist opened his mouth and then shrugged in public, which is a brave thing to do. He responded in a careful, formal cadence. The man with the ship's wake crest listened, smiled with one side of his mouth, and replied with a small adjustment that invited our linguist to relax. He did. "His name is Decimus, of the Aurelian Concordium," the linguist whispered. "He bids us welcome to the threshold port. He says they have waited for us as one waits for rain. Ask him if he knows what happened to us, I said. Where we are. And what he means by threshold. The linguist traded phrases, and Decimus talked with his hands, as people do when meaning feels bigger than grammar. He pointed at the sky, sliced his palm sideways to show a plane, then cupped both hands like one might to catch a bird. When he finished, he looked tired and proud, like a father when a child gets through a fever. He says, the linguist said, feeling his way, that our sea lies on the other side of a thin place, that storms open it in long years, and sometimes people and things slip through. He says their city has been a harbor for such slipping for longer than the records are neat. They call it the threshold. They call us sea folk when they're being kind. He says they have sons who fought sea folk and daughters who learned our songs. He says his mother's mother boiled herbs, a woman from our side showed her. And what is the Aurelian concordium? I asked. Decimus touched his chest and then made a square with his hands, one that grew and grew again. The linguist translated, the concordium is their world, he says, a pact of cities under law and roads under the pact. There is an emperor, he used, a word close to one of ours, but not quite. There are assemblies and legions and baths and a calculation of stars. He says his city is not the greatest, but it is the oldest that watches the threshold. A woman stepped forward then, not from the rank, but from a second line, in which the cloth was finer and the posture different. She wore a necklace of stamped squares that would be coin in any world, and small golden discs shaped like suns sewn into her shawl. She looked at me for a long moment, and then spoke in Latin the way a teacher speaks to a bright child. When she touched my sleeve, it was the gesture of someone checking cloth not for status, but for wear. The linguist swallowed. She asks if we carry pestilence. She asks if we carry cures. She asks if we have hungry with us that needs soothing. And she asks, and here he sounded surprised, if our hearts are tired. I thought of the pallets, of the helmets stacked like bowls, of the way the forklifts had moved in arcs like filling the outline of an animal. Tell her yes to all four, I said, and ask if they will let us tie up and share our food. Use the word for gift, the medic murmured. If they have a law about gift and exchange, you don't want to stumble into debt. We tied up. Ropes make introductions where language cannot. Their ropes were hempen simple, ours nylon and bright. And between the two we made the dock an equation that would not let us drift away from each other. A boy ran along the edge with a basket of oranges the size of fists. He threw one to our medic with a laugh and then flushed when the medic bowed more deeply than he'd expected. The elephant watched all of this and lifted its trunk and exhaled a polite hello. I thought the soldiers would demand weapons first. They didn't. They demanded order in another way. They set up a space on the quay, marked by chalk and the crossing of two spears, and within it we were allowed to be ourselves. Outside it, we would be theirs. It was an elegant compromise. We mimicked it with cargo crates, making a square, leaving our corners relaxed the way you do when you want to be inviting and not a fortress. We set out a hand-washing station and a triage bench and a table for papers that would, for at least a while, mean nothing to anyone but us. The woman with the coin necklace came into our square and sat on the triage bench without asking permission. Maya pressed her lips together to keep from laughing and then pulled a stool up and sat as well. We had protocols for first contact that no one had expected to use on a world with aqueducts. They began with washing hands together. Maya mimed it slowly, carefully, and the woman imitated her, and then took the soap out of Maya's hand because pride is also a protocol. We learned her name Livia Aureliana and her title, which meant something between magistrate and minister and older sister. She said the words for cough and fever and boil and rat and night sweat, while pointing to places on her own body as if to show us she owned the problems and we were not to be ashamed of them. She had a ring on her left thumb with a small green stone that had been worried smooth. When we brought out the first vials of vaccine, she made a sound that was not relief and not grief, but lived in their neighborhood. Decimus returned with a cohort of men whose armor clinked the way ice sounds in a glass. He stamped on the cobbles to get our attention and then made a gesture with his arms that meant make room and make a show of it, because a general loves the theater of movement as much as a priest. Behind him came the elephants 2, then 3, and the crowd on the walls leaned forward with a wave motion that would, in other circumstances, presage a riot. The elephants knelt. On their backs, in howdahs wrapped in leather, sat machines I had not expected. They were sky mirrors, polished bronze or something like it, etched with rings, set at precise angles. Cables ran from them to spindles that smelled like resin. One of the elephant's handlers, it felt wrong to call him a mahout. He was that, and an engineer and a priest checked the tension of a knot with his teeth. The linguist was the one who gave it a word. Interferometers, he said softly. Crude, but if you made 100 of them and put them on a hill, you could see more than a man with a book could ever write down. They aimed them at the sky, no, not at the Sunday, at the seam. He was right. Above the harbor, the light had a bruise, and if you had not just fallen through it, you might have called it tastefully ominous and gone about your life. The mirrors winked at that bruise like the eyes of a stubborn child. The handlers turned cranks whose whine had a rhythm. The crowd murmured in polite unison, the way an audience will when the show reaches a piece they love. Threshold, Livia said, seeing us see. Your sea makes our storms forget the rest of the sky. It opens, and things fall through. Sometimes people, sometimes animals, sometimes just the glow. We have watched for 1,000 some years. And here she made a flicking gesture, the way you do when you say a number you know is both true and misleading. It tore a bridge once. It took a mountain range and left us a better road. It steals sometimes from us, and sometimes from our neighbors, beyond the desert. Once, a wind brought us 1,000 books and never explained itself. How do you stop it? Maya asked. Livia looked at the elephants. We don't, she said. We listen. We write what it tells us. We follow its weather. We tell our children which years will be hard and which will be birth years. We have a law about what to accept. We have a law about what to refuse. We keep our boxes ready. Boxes? I asked, thinking of cargo and smiles. She tapped her necklace. The squares were stamped, I saw now, not just with heads and wreaths, but with patterns, concentric rings, radiating lines, sensitive geometries that looked like the fingerprints of rain. Every magistracy keeps a chest of things we know, the threshold admires, she said. It is like a guest who must be seated correctly. Feed it too richly and it slumbers, and then the next year it wakes and demands a feast harsher than you can afford. Starve it, and it crashes into your neighbor's wall. It is a child. It is an old god. It is a road. You make offerings, the linguist whispered, half to himself, so as not to offend the part of the world he did not yet understand. We make patterns, Livia said, taking no offense. We give it the comfort of repetition. We remind it that we were here yesterday and will be again tomorrow. We leave a space empty for it on the day the stars tell us to. We prefer it not to learn that we love any one thing too much. She was smarter than me in a way I wanted to copy. I could feel the sea inside me doing its soft sigh between ribs. We do something like that at home, I said. We call it logistics. We make patterns in the chaos and then we feed the right part of the chaos to make the pattern hold. She looked at me then, the way one judge looks at another across a room. Then we are colleagues, she said. You are the sort of person my city keeps waking up for. We got to work. The thing about nations is that the people in them bleed the same color. We tested for fevers and set up a cordon for the coughing and fidgeted with our chlorine until the taste of the water fell into the range that makes a human used to wine say okay and drink. We made a waiting room by calling it a garden. We invited the children to wash their hands and sang a song about it that had a chorus you could do with your feet. We asked a priest to bless the vaccines not because they needed it, but because people do better when the things that help them come with permission. Word went out beyond the harbor. The Concordium's banners arrived like slow birds. A delegation from inland came with gifts we didn't know how to accept: salted fish the size of my forearm, a cage with doves that were too beautiful to eat, a bolt of linen that made Maya bury her face in it and sigh. News traveled as fast as a horse and a road can carry it. We learned what it meant to be the subject of a rumor in a city that told time by gossip. The first tension came not from swords but from kindness. We had a small stockpile. They had great need. Livia made lists that were both practical and politically clever. She gave out balm and biscuits in a way that made a rival's wife stop sobbing and start managing. But the palace atop the hill, because of course there was a palace atop a hill, sent down a scroll rolled and sealed with a sunburst. Decimus read it, as if he suspected he was being watched. His jaw moved in a muscle I had seen in men who were good at saying no but lived with a lifetime of saying yes. The emperor's steward invites your leader to present himself at court, the linguist said, watching Decimus as he said it. He invites you to bring a tribute of your marvels in recognition that the gods have favored you with novelty. He invites you to demonstrate these marvels at the Feast of Threshold, which is in 6 days. He invites you to kneel, and here the linguist took a breath, and to bring with you interpreters, a surgeon, and a small elephant that does not bite. No elephants, Maya said. We're fresh out. Surgeon is possible, I said. Interpreter too. As for kneeling, Decimus rubbed his jaw muscle harder. Then he did something that made me adore him. He tossed the scroll into the water. The crowd made a sound like winter air. He let the scroll float away, then plucked it out again with exaggerated care, and held it as if he might kiss it. He grinned at Livia like a boy showing his mother a frog he shouldn't have. I must go up the hill tomorrow, he said to us through the linguist. I would rather not go alone. A man who arrives at a feast without friends is a goose on the chopping block. We went. The palace had porticos and law courts, and a room where the floor was a mosaic of a woman swimming with an eel, which someone had polished with oil until it looked wet. Officials wore rings like messages. Servants wore sandals with soles thicker than the skulls of the men they served. The emperor did not make us kneel because Livia had gotten there first and had, I imagine, looked at him with that administrative tenderness that makes you see your best self if you are not quite a fool. He was not a fool. He was a man who had been taught that his body was the nation and his breath its weather. He had eyes like olive pits, hard, oiled. He asked us questions in formal language and informal ones, which he quickly learned gave better answers. He walked us past maps that were maps, the Concordium with its satiny imperial roads, the deserts beyond where the ink changed its mind, the sea with monsters where the cartographer had run out of patience and one that was not a map at all, a grid of pegs and string that no one in our party could make sense of until Livia cleared her throat and put her palm, carefully, on a corner of it. The emperor nodded as you do when an old friend reminds you to set your shoulders back. It is their weather, the linguist whispered to Maya, whose ear was better than mine. Not water or wind. Threshold weather. They keep its moods pinned like butterflies. They have a calendar for the next 8 grand storms and a list of what it will steal. We are on the list. The court had philosophers the way an army has cooks. Too many to be trusted. Exactly the right number to keep 1,000 men fed. A gray-haired man with a freckle on his lip asked me whether our ship's engines were water-driven or wind-driven, and then, when I tried to explain diesel the way you explain a joke to a child, he put a hand on my sleeve and asked if he could feel the vibration of our machines. He put his cheek to the pillar we leaned against, as if it were the flank of a horse. Your engines are hearts, he said, and made 3 quick signs as if to apologize to someone for saying something religious about a practical machine. By the second day, we had something like a plan, and it looked very little like conquest, which suits me. We would help with fevers and night sweats. They would share their threshold weather with us so that, when the seam tried to take us back, we could decide whether to go humbly or anchor ourselves. We would not show our guns in the square. They would not march their war beasts past our mooring. We would host a small clinic for a certain sort of child. They had a way of describing congenital defects that was kinder than ours. They called those children bendings, as if the moon had influenced them too much, and they would let us watch the elephant mirrors at work. You could feel the city relax around the arrangement the way a cat relaxes when you move the chair it likes closer to a sunbeam. Tension came anyway, as it always does, sideways and with the seed of something ordinary. A boy, of course, a boy decided to be brave. He took a metal box from our square that had the word spares printed on it in a font that made English look like it was trying too hard. He had the box balanced on his shoulder, and he was grinning in a way that made the word mischief into something generous in my mind. When Decimus saw him, Decimus called to him. The boy pretended not to hear. Livia did not call. She stepped into the boy's path and took the weight of the box as if it were a loaf of bread. The boy's grin died, but he didn't let go. Livia said something in a tone that made the crowd quiet like soot settling. Then, in Latin, she turned to me and said, "If your boxes go missing, we will be much more frightened than we are now. It will mean we didn't seal what needed sealing. It will mean the city has lost its rhythm." She shifted the box as if it were her own chore and handed it back into our square. The boy cried in the clean way of boys who have not yet learned to turn it into anger. I remembered the thousands of small thefts in cities where we'd worked, each the result of a world being as it is, not as it should be. I remembered the times I had counted pallets as if counting could calm hunger. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just keeps your hands busy. The sixth day, the feast, the city dressed the way people do when they want to reassure themselves they are not as poor or frightened as they might be. Garlands, cloaks with extra braids, the amphitheater lit like a bowl for the sky to eat from. The emperor sat under a canopy of pale leather that someone had rubbed until it felt like a mother's cheek. Elephants stood at the four corners like punctuation marks. And there, above all of it, the bruise and the light deepened. I was on the wall with the elephant mirrors. Their handlers adjusted lenses with a ritualist's attention. The machines thrummed. A boy replaced a broken gear with a polished one from a chest lined with velvet. He did it as if he were replacing his own front tooth. Below, Maya waited with her kit, a row of syringes lined up like a flute. Livia stood beside a woman too well dressed not to be dangerous and whispered in her ear with the intimacy of a nurse and a conspirator combined. The feast had portions. A choral hymn that felt like a question repeated until an answer came. Bread broken in a pattern. The release of doves, some of which declined to be symbolic, and landed on an awning where they cooed and preened like the practical little gods they are. The emperor poured wine into 4 cups, and then poured each cup onto the ground at the corners of the dais. Children piped on flutes they would break by afternoon. In another world, I might have called it quaint. Here, at the threshold, it was engineering. When the seam opened, it did not roar. It exhaled, but not like a mountain, like a sleeping thing trying a new dream. The bruise in the sky unknotted like a muscle. The mirrors found an angle they liked and held it. Something like the smell of ozone, like the taste of new pennies, went across the spectators and made the hair on my arms reach for heaven. A ripple moved through the harbor. Not water. The space above it fussed. The lines on the peg and string map in the palace must have tightened until the strings sang. Even at that distance, in my mind I heard them. Our ship responded like a woman being called by name from another room. She turned as if to say what, and the mooring lines groaned. The men on the dock made those oh God motions you recognize across cultures. The ones where your hands do the shape of panic before your mouth. Decimus shouted something that was mostly consonants. Livia looked at me and did not shout. She made the shape of a rhythm with her hand. She tapped it on her thigh. Tap, 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 top. For a second, I thought she meant my heart. Then the word mine, ugly and beautiful, rose like a novice swimmer. Logistics. I ran. Down the stairs, across the ramp, into the square we had made with our careless kindness. Ropes. We had rope. We had chains. We had anchors the size of small gods. The question wasn't whether we had enough. It was whether we had the right kind. See how the lines are straining? I shouted at a crewman who had never seen a dimensional seam in his life and had, until 10 minutes ago, believed that the trick of keeping a hospital ship's supplies fed was a matter of persuasive emails. You don't pull back against that. You give it other things to love. You give it rhythm and you make it choose. We brought out pumps. You wouldn't think a pump could be an argument, but if you've ever soothed a baby with a washing machine's thrum, you know better. We set 3 big ones on the pier and let them sing. We tuned their valves until they made that rhythm Livia had tapped. We hung chains across the square, not to hold the ship but to define a shape for the world to consider. We asked our patrol boats to idle at particular RPMs. We asked the elephant handlers what music the mirrors liked best. One man thumped the side of his howdah with the heel of his hand, quick and then slow. The mirrors sang back. The ship stopped trying to leave. She leaned. She flirted with the seam like a dancer testing a partner's balance. The crowd murmured the way a congregation does when they see the trick beginning to work, even if they do not understand it. Maya stood with her children, the benders lined up behind her like a little army of stoics. She had a way of making a room into a hearth. The seam, being a child, as Livia had said, decided for a minute that it wanted to sit at our hearth and put its feet on our stool. And then violence, which always arrives late and out of breath, made its play. Men from inland, marked with tattoos I had learned mean that town you hate chose the feast as a moment to be noticed. They brought fire they shouldn't have brought. They did it because a seam reminds men that the world is bigger than they are. And small men answer that reminder poorly. A stout jar filled with oil and a promise arced out from a rooftop. It fell true. The awning over the dais went to gold all at once. The crowd inhaled in a single sound, which is maybe the best argument for God I can name. Decimus was already moving, as if he'd been waiting for this fight all his life. The soldiers had a drill for fire at feast, the way our ship had a drill for mass casualty we hope never. Men used their cloaks the right way. The way you do when you've smothered flames since your father taught you with cloth that smelled like bread. The jar throwers were taken the way stubborn children are taken. Roughly, but with a mind to their humanity. The elephant nearest the dais lifted its trunk and sprayed water from a bladder into the teeth of the fire. Maya's children did not run. They held their places because she had told them the greatest magic in the world is to stay where you are when everything asks you to leave. But one of the jars, a second, lobbed in a lazy parabola, careless and perfect. It hit a mirror. The mirror shivered. Its angle altered. The seam, which we had been coaxing like a horse, flinched. The pumps faltered by a hair. The ship leaned harder than is polite. We had to choose. Fast enough that if we were wrong we could pretend we had meant to be right. Either we let the ship go and hoped we would fall with her through to our world, with the knowledge that our mooring lines might then act like blades along the quay, or we held her and risked someone we loved being taken. The emperor had risen. His canopy had gone to lace. Livia had soot on her cheek. Decimus was both extremely alive and very old in that moment, which happens to men who know their number could be one lower in a heartbeat. Maya made the decision for us, which is why I love doctors beyond sense. She turned her body so that the seam could see the children behind her. She opened her hands, as if showing the sky a small, valuable thing it had forgotten it loved. She was saying, without language, here is a better pattern. Here is a repetition you should want. Here is a rhythm you would be proud to keep. I adjusted a valve on a pump the way a choir boy corrects a note and felt the thrum fall into that heartbeat Livia had tapped. The elephant handler slapped his howdah again, and the mirror, unbelievably, remembered its place. The seam, being younger than all of us and older than our taste in hats, chose to sit down. You could feel it. The city exhaled. The ship settled with the creak that means she thinks you have learned something. After, there were apologies, the way there always are, official and unnecessary, and made by people who couldn't bear debt like a stone in a shoe. There were also the apologies that matter. A small boy came to our square with the spares box held out like an offering. Livia gave him a biscuit and a job keeping flies off a bucket of water with a switch. He took it as if recruited to a glorious army. We built a ward in the bathhouse district because the air there was clean and the light generous. We filled it with the precise clutter that makes a hospital a universe. Labels with neat hands, a schedule on a wall no one looks at and everyone respects, a box of toys that will be the best memory of a child's worst day. Maya made a friend of the woman who had a ring on each toe, which turned out to be a way of counting for midwives. A midwife counts children before they breathe. A logistician counts their blankets. We stayed a week, then 2. The seam became a character in our story rather than the plot. The emperor permitted himself to smile at me once, sideways. Decimus taught me to read a certain kind of fear in the tilt of a horse's ears. Livia and I argued amicably in front of a map that stretched from the sea to a place she called the Fire Bowl, and that I guessed was a caldera inland. We became known not only as the sea folk, but as the Steady Song, which is a name you can live in. I had thought the twist in the story was the seam itself. It wasn't. It was a room below the palace where Livia took us on a day when a wind from the desert made everyone's eyes sting, as if they had all at once thought too hard about grief. The room was not secret in the sense that secrets are hidden. It was secret in the sense that you do not invite everyone to your grandmother's kitchen. It was full of boxes, chest upon chest of wood cured with smoke and lined with wool and stamped with those radiating patterns that had looked to me like polite decorations. The floor had been worn by careful feet. "These are our lullabies," Livia said. And only then did I see that the chests were not full of things, exactly, but of rhythms. Rods with marks for the beat of the pumps. Twine tied in knots that, if you ran it through your hands, would teach your fingers to move valves at the right moments. Bells tuned to argue with a seam's foolishness. Little drums made of hide that had been made thin by generations of grandmothers pressing their thumbs through the hours. We preserve them the way you preserve sourdough, she said softly. We lend to cities up the coast when their thresholds are fussy. We take back on long winters when ours needs to be reminded who it is. Maya reached out like a thief and then drew back like a priest. We do this, she said to me. Haven't you felt it? The way we fall into rhythm together. The way the ship calms when the forklifts move like cousins instead of like strangers. The way the pumps sing when you tune them as if you were telling a bedtime story. Livia smiled in the way that makes you forgive people their crowns. We thought we had been alone, she said. We have been waiting a long time to learn otherwise. The twist of the knife, because every calm story that earns its salt must carry. One came on the day 3 weeks in, when a handful of men in helmets, shaped like half-moons, arrived. With a wagon that had a problem. The wheel had cracked. Not the wooden spokes, the metal band. The metal was not iron. It was not bronze. It was some alloy my eye wanted to call modern and part of my mind refused. When we levered the wheel up and off and set it on blocks, a boy crawling under the wagon, because boys crawl under things, said a thing that was both holy and obscene. There, set into the axle as casually as a blessing, was a bearing like one from our world. It had seen salt and dust and neglect, and it spun with a shy whisper, as if trying not to offend. Where did you get that? I asked the half-moon men, who looked like magistrates of a town far enough inland, to pretend the sea was something you tell your children to make them wash. They shrugged. We all know that shrug. It means I inherited this problem, and the solution both, and neither makes me rich. They said a name not Latin, but close to a word written on a map everyone had been careful not to bring up in polite conversation. It sat inland, at the edge of the place they called the Fire Bowl, a place where thresholds were not storms but springs. We went. Of course we went. You cannot be the sort of person who stands on a dock and moves pumps in time with elephants and not go to the place where the world lays its patterns out and forgets to tidy them. The road was a good road. The Concordium was proud of its roads the way artists are proud of their calluses. Along the way we saw fields that had been taught to be terraces, and an aqueduct that was mended with stones taken from a temple no one worshipped in anymore. Children asked us what fish tasted like. Men asked about tools. Women asked us to bless their daughters not because we can, but because it is a comfort to be cared for by strangers before you are married to the idea of belonging to a place until you die. The Fire Bowl was what Livia had called it. It had been a caldera when mountains were more ambitious. Now it was a wide, shallow, mineral-streaked bowl that at certain seasons made a sound like a kettle when the wind asked it to. In the center was a platform like a raft made of stone, and on it, a structure that I had no word for. You could see pieces of it that were not of this world. A strut that had a seam like a weld, but not ours. A lens that was a cousin to the elephant's mirrors, but with markings in a script that wanted to be Arabic and failed, and wanted to be Cyrillic and failed, and wanted to be human, and succeeded only in reminding us we had not invented ourselves. Someone had brought, long ago, machines here. The Concordium had adopted them as one adopts a child no one else wants. Decimus stood with his fingers curled around the hilt of his sword, the way he did when he didn't know if he was at a birth or awake. We did not take this, he said before I could accuse him with my spine. We kept it. We learned what we could without letting it tell us what to be. A man came out of the stones like a lizard does on his belly, in a way that made him look like part of the place. He had a beard that had been trimmed with a knife. He had eyes that had memorized wind. He made a bow that was almost rude, and then rolled a little cart closer to us with the agility of a man who loves wheels. On the cart was a box with a handle. He turned the handle. The box made a sound. I had heard the sound before. It was the sound a cheap little crank radio makes when you're a child and you are alone with a storm. And your grandfather told you once how to find the station where men talk like the world is small enough to fix. Sea song, Livia said. We have kept it this way. We do not pretend to understand how to open or close it without it opening or closing us. We ask it sometimes. We can persuade sometimes. We have made a peace with it. We will never ask it for anything we cannot bear to lose. We spun the crank. The radio spoke in static. And then, for a moment, just a moment, you could hear a voice. English. Female. A weather report about a storm in the Ionian, followed by a telephone number that had an area code that would have made a retired mariner cry just to hear it. The wind shifted, and the voice slid away. We stood there like ghosts at our own funeral. The edges of the bowl burned with a herb that did not know its own name. Livia looked at me and saw my heart like a thing in my hand. "You could go home if you wished," she said softly. "You could do it today and leave us with our elephants and our lullabies. Or you could teach us one more trick and take one of ours with you so that our two worlds have a longer thread between them when the knots slip." It was the only place in the story where someone might call me a hero if they needed to. Use the word. I made the wrong decision and then the right one. The wrong one was considering the ship and her pumps and the neatness of her corridors as if they were in my care because my title told me so. The right one was remembering that my work had always been to make sure other people could do theirs. "We'll leave the ship," I said. "Not forever. Enough to remind the Seam which world has the better coffee. Enough to make the Emperor keep a chair at table for us because he likes stories. Enough to make the firebowl hum our lullaby when it gets lonely." Maya stepped forward with her hands raised the way you do when the wind has an idea and you would like to make it feel welcome. "We'll trade people," she said. "You send us a Decimus. We'll send you a weaver. We'll braid your ropes with ours until no one remembers who started which knot." Livia smiled like a woman who had been promised 2 berths in a house that had expected none. "I will come," she said. And with those 3 words, she surprised her emperor, which is a thing to savor. "I am my city, and my city is me. If I do not learn to love your pumps as much as I love our elephants, then I am not the person you believed me to be. And if I do, perhaps your world will walk 1 step less arrogantly, and mine 1 step less fearfully." Decimus grunted a laugh. "If Livia goes, I go. If only to make sure your men do not give our coffee a name worse than it deserves." We braided it. Not with rope, though there was plenty of that. With people. With the steady beat of gifts and requests across a seam that learned to hum to our lullabies and looked less like a wound. We left the hospital ship for a season with an engine that could be convinced to idle its way through what the seam wanted to be. We took Livia and 3 elephant handlers and a boy whose job title we translated as Mirror Bride, and a grandmother who knew the rhythm that made goats breed out of season, and whose hands, blessedly, fixed 2 of our temperamental pumps by listening to them like a midwife listens to a laboring woman. In exchange, we left Maya and 2 infectious disease fellows and a logistics petty officer who could teach a wall to stand up straighter and a small book, with a cloth cover full of recipes that were also instructions about how to hold a city's breath safely in a fever. We wrote the recipes as if they were gossip, so they would spread. The Emperor blessed it the way you bless, something you cannot prevent. He kept his canopy high because that was who he was. He asked me whether our world's emperor would welcome him. I told him we had no emperor. He did not believe me and nodded as if I had told him something sensitive and shameful. He asked Livia to write to him. She promised to send him a letter on paper that smells like the sea. They had a way of making paper that made me ache. On the day we set the pumps to sing in a new key and felt the seam soften in a particular way that meant home was listening, we stood on the firebowl platform and held onto parts of the machine that looked like levers but could have been ribs. Livia took my hand because logistics officers get sentimental when machines hum correctly. Maya took Decimus's not because she loved him, which she might have, but because he had never put his hand on a machine with faith in it. The grandmother tuned a pump by humming a song that had no words, and then told me, with great dignity, that I had poor rhythm but a good heart. We went through. The seam did not grab us. It escorted us like a hostess, with the sort of manners that make you proud of your shoes. We came into a sky that was the right blue, and a sea that smelled like laundry and diesel and our lives. The hospital ship blinked her lights as if waking from a nap. My clipboard was where I had left it. The cormorant, it might have been the same one. I decided it was skimmed the water and looked at herself in it again, briefly satisfied. The radio we had cranked in the firebowl spoke, and our comms officer dropped a pencil. "We're on a dozen people's screens," he said. "We went off like a fuse 3 weeks ago and have been a ghost ever since. There's a satellite that wants to kiss us and 3 admirals who think they own us and 1 grandmother who wants to know if we have eaten. We had. We had eaten fish, salted in a way that made my memory keep it like a marble in a pocket. We had eaten oranges that a boy delivered with the seriousness of a man carrying documents. We had drunk coffee that wasn't coffee with people who did not need to be told twice a rhythm that keeps a city safe. We had learned that we were not special because we could make guns spit or ships hum, but because we could make 4 different kinds of people hold a pump at the same time and believe that the world could like it. We told our story in rooms without windows because the kind of people who get invited into rooms without windows believe secrets will protect the world from its worst self. We drew maps and then erased parts of them because some mysteries are healthier than metes and bounds. We said, in a dozen different polite ways, that if we handled this badly, we would break the one thing that had held trust shaped into rhythm. There were those who wanted to send an army, because armies are what you send when you feel small. There were those who wanted to close the seam with a bomb, because we love the spectacle of finality. But the radio in the fireball spoke on clear nights in certain portions of the year, and a woman in a city that will never admit it was afraid of our coffee read a letter into it. She said the children were fattening, and the fevers of the season had been less cruel, and the wheels had cracked less often because they knew which parts of the road to praise as they moved across it. She said a word in Latin that, loosely translated, meant, "We found you in our pattern. We put you in a box and loved you." We sent back a letter in a bag hung on a buoy and tied to an anchor chain because that is how we had learned to speak. We sent a song we had stolen from an elephant. We sent a recipe that we promised would not make your neighbor jealous if you shared it. We sent a small pump with a crank that made a sound like a child's toy. There was a war eventually. There always is. Not between us and the Concordium. Between us and ourselves and the men who think a seam means a door and a door means a right. But even that war was quieter, when we turned down its volume with rhythm and a kitchen's attention. We put people in rooms and made them wash their hands together. We asked them to count the beats with us. We loosened our fists. I sometimes dream of the fire bowl. In my dream, the bowl is full of polished coins, and each coin is a face. Some are ours, some are theirs, some are faces I have never seen in any world. The seam above fidgets, making its mind up about what kind of weather it wants to be. In the dream, I am not afraid. I have a clipboard and an orange balanced on it. I have a rope looped loosely over my shoulder. A hand reaches for mine. Sometimes it is Livia's, sometimes it is Maya's, sometimes it is the grandmother's, sometimes it is the small boys who returned the spares box. The hand feels like a promise humans have always made to each other, and often kept. We named the lullaby we sang in the harbor that first day, after a thing my mother used to say when the power went out and the refrigerator hummed back to life. She would stand with her palm on its door and say, "You see? It wants to work. That's the secret of us. We want to work. We want to hum. We want to make patterns and then be brave enough to change them when we love something new." If you go to the Threshold City now, if you are kind and you have someone to vouch for you, and you tell the sea what you want like a person and not like a thief, you will find an elephant handler teaching a girl to slap a howdah in rhythm. You will find Decimus and a petty officer from Mercia arguing about whether you step with your toes first or your heels when you carry a pump. You will find a wall where someone has painted a circle of concentric rings that look like rain, and below it a word in 2 languages that means home does not have to be a fixed point to be real. And some nights, when the seam is sleepy and the mirrors have been covered so they do not tempt themselves with work, if you lie on the palace roof and look straight up, you can see it wink. Like a child under a blanket, like an old god learning new jokes, like a door deciding it is happier as a window for now. We are not special because we conquered. We are not special because we invented fire twice. We are special because we can, together, make a rhythm out of fear and teach even a seam in the sky to count with us. We are special because we can decide, when a city asks us to choose between leaving and staying, to do both, and to do it in a way that makes one world less lonely and the other less proud. I still count waves. I will until I die. Every tally a promise kept. Every promise a small, stubborn proof that the universe, like any child, loves a bedtime story better when we tell it together, on time, in a voice that says the night is big, yes, but we are bigger when we hum.